Good afternoon. My name is Tim O'Rourke. I'm here for the fourth of four lectures on the state of American politics. It's great to be back at Westminster Canterbury, and I hope that you're all doing well, staying safe, and I look forward to the day when we can be back together in person. This series focuses on something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. Today's message deals with profanity and the decline of civility in American politics, but to revisit the previous session, something old looked at the legacy of Thomas Jefferson and the continuing influence of the Declaration of Independence. Something new looked at three potentially groundbreaking cases now before the Supreme Court dealing with the question of whether Title VII of the Civil Rights Act covers gay and transgender employees. Something borrowed last week looked at the federal debt and deficit, and obviously in the wake of the coronavirus, the debt is growing rapidly in what we hope will be a positive and ultimately successful response from the federal and state governments to the pandemic. Something blue features two ducks fowl in my backyard. Let me remind you of the questions that guide the inquiry here, the big questions. First, was America well begun? How do the founders' values continue to shape contemporary life? It's where we began, and you'll see as we proceed through the day that we'll come back to this question. What is the second question? What is the link or tension between fair process, just outcomes in a democratic society? And in the second lecture, we considered whether discrimination in employment law was ultimately a question for the Supreme Court or the Congress to decide. The third question in relation to the debt crisis: in the absence of an existential crisis, can democracy address and solve big problems? Clearly, we have an existential crisis. The government is at work to solve the immediate pandemic problem, but huge problems will remain afterwards, and we can wonder whether the spirit of cooperation that has pervaded the response to the pandemic will continue once we're through this medical crisis. And finally, today, can we find common ground through meaningful civil conversations? And before I get to the topic of the day, I wanted to talk about four stories in my own situation. First concerns Robert McNeil, whom many of you will remember was the co-anchor of the McNeil-Lehrer Report, or the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, as it was also named, from the mid-1970s through the mid-1990s. And about 2005, I had the privilege of attending a small dinner with Robert McNeil, who was going to be a speaker at Salisbury University. And as the conversation flowed, we talked about, around the table, about factors that had shaped American politics over the last 40 or 50 years. And I happened to mention that I thought a major event occurred in the 1960s when television surpassed newspapers as the principal source of news among the American citizenry. And to my delight and surprise, not only did Mr. McNeil respond to that, but in fact, he was able to identify the precise month, day, and year when the poll came out indicating that television now surpassed newspapers. And clearly the implication was that if people were getting their news from television, it was a little less rich and nuanced and more focused on dramatic events than one would get from reading the newspaper. Well, the second story concerns Curtis Gans, who was for some years the director of the Center for the Study of the American Electorate. And in the aftermath of national elections, the press and the public would turn to the center for an estimate of what percentage of American citizens actually turned out to vote. And Gans was a great proponent of civic participation. Well, sometime in the early 90s, and I can't remember whether I actually saw this in person or watched it on television, but Gans was on a panel that was discussing innovations in technology. And one of the other panelists said, with the advent of the internet, we now have the possibility for education of the electorate in ways that heretofore were unthought of. And Gans looked up and he said, well, you know, they said that about television. And clearly, television never quite fulfilled its promise as a source of edification for the electorate. And I want to suggest, and you'll find as we go through today's presentation, that in some ways the internet has not fulfilled its promise either. Well, story number 3, my encounter with Siri. And many of you will recognize that Siri is the voice-activated guide who will respond to your questions on your iPhone and direct you to information and play your music and otherwise act as your aid, perhaps. So a few years ago, after I had gotten a new iPhone, I had turned on Siri and had left it on and went to attend a meeting when I was working at the Virginia Wesleyan. And I was sitting in a conference room with 10 or 12 other people. And when it came my turn to speak, I made an impassioned plea for my point of view on the subject of the day. And when I concluded, my iPhone said, well, that would be your opinion. And from that day on, I never activated Siri again. Now, the 4th story you'll have to wait for. And let's move on to the topic of the day, Something Blue, Profanity and the Decline of Civility in the Public Square. And the purpose of this topic was to answer a question that has troubled me for some time, and that is, why are politicians doing a lot of swearing? And to get into this topic, let me explore the various meanings of blue, because when I thought about the topic, I thought about profane language, as in curse a blue streak, which appears in the Oxford English Dictionary. But it turns out that blue has a variety of meanings, and I've tried to integrate most of these into my presentation today. Blue can also mean intoxicated, and it can mean faithful, as in true blue. It can also mean censorious, someone who censors, as in an editor with a blue pencil. But it also can mean something like a blue law. And I recall growing up in Pennsylvania when baseball games had to end at 6 o'clock on Sunday because of the blue law. But blue can also mean livid with effort, excitement, as in blue in the face. And I also think of kind of a true blue flame in natural gas. If the flame is burning yellow, well, then it's not quite an efficient and hot flame. And so you make an adjustment so it becomes a pure blue flame. But blue can also mean, dismal, unpromising, depressing. And I also thought on the other side, it could mean happy, as in blue skies, as in the Irving Berlin tune, blue skies smiling at me. And in the course of researching this, I also found out that sacre bleu in the French is the French effort to avoid swearing, much as we say, oh my gosh, in the English language. You can look it up. So let's talk about this overarching question, why are politicians swearing? Well, I think they're swearing partly because they're unthinking and need to rein in their approach to civic engagement and to public discourse. But I also think that salty language is a symptom of some bigger problems that I want to talk about. These problems include the defects of the new technology as a form of communication, also the incredibly tense and balanced competition between the political parties. It also reflects on unrealistic expectations that we impose on our governments. It reflects a loss of confidence in our institutions and the loss of effectiveness of our institutions. And it reflects a failure of both citizens and politicians to engage in meaningful conversations about reform. I want to suggest in the end that there's a way out of our predicament, but let's go back and look at both the problem of profanity and then these bigger problems. The decline of our public discourse. There is actually a study of Capitol Hill lawmakers' tweets that found in 2018 that there were 2,600 uses of curse words, as against only 83 in 2014. That's a kind of general snapshot of the use of bad language emanating from Capitol Hill, but we could point to specific examples. Very recently, in a confrontation at a campaign event, the presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden told an auto worker that that man was full of, well, you can fill in the blank. Other Democratic presidential candidates have used the F or the S word, and they include Beto O'Rourke, no relation, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Cory Booker. Rashida Tlaib, on her arrival to Congress as a new member in January of 2019, famously promised to, quote, impeach the MF, referring to President Trump. Well, and as for President Trump, the New York Times labeled him, quote, the profanity president for his frequent use, even in public rallies, of the S word, the BS word, and the A word, along with milder forms such as, well, I can say these, I guess, hell and crap. And so our public discourse, I think, has declined. And the question is why? I think one factor is the growing use of the internet. And recall that the count I gave you of instances of profanity involved a compilation of tweets. And in keeping with our definition of blue, there is a factor of intoxication and addiction in the use of the internet. And one of the important early books to point this out, early having appeared in 2011, is a book by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. And the very title of the book suggests that much of what goes on in the internet, tweeting and email, is not deep or serious thinking. And Carr argues in this book that the use of the internet, texting, and other digital forms of communication is changing the way our brains process information to our detriment. And he writes, one thing is very clear: if you were to set out to invent a medium that would rewrite our mental circuits as quickly and as thoroughly as possible, you would probably end up designing something that works a lot like the internet. It's not just that we tend to use the net regularly, even obsessively, and that's the addictive part. It's that the net delivers precisely the kind of sensory and cognitive stimuli, repetitive, intensive, interactive, addictive, that have been shown to result in strong and rapid alterations in brain functions and circuits. Very recent article by Adam Garfinkel called The Erosion of Deep Literacy builds on the work of Carr. And Garfinkel points out that few cognitive scientists doubt that the so-called multitasking is merely the ability to get many things done quickly and poorly. And no one doubts that the heavy screen use has destroyed attention spans. And Garfinkel worries about the decline in what he calls deep reading. And he says that deep reading is what ultimately allowed Americans to become we the people capable of self-government. And he goes on to speculate, so could it be that the failures of the American political class to fashion useful solutions to public and foreign policy challenges turn not just on polarization and hyperpartisanship, but also on the strong possibility that many of these book that I know and admire is called Digital Minimalism. Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World by Cal Newport, who is a Georgetown University computer science professor. This book is actually a kind of manual for breaking your addiction, my addiction, to the cell phone and the computer, and scaling back to those truly essential apps that one needs, but avoiding the kind of addictive use of the internet and texting, email that proves to be an intrusion at dinner conversations. And in this book, Newport points to a telling episode on Bill Maher's TV show on HBO. Here's what Maher said: "Checking your likes is the new smoking. Philip Morris just wanted your lungs. The App Store wants your soul." And the reference here is to the fact that the various apps are designed to engage you continuously. And there is a phrase called clickbait, by which you go to one screen and are encouraged to go to another screen. You start reading one article and there are links to other articles, and you move through a series of articles. And the purpose of clickbaits is less to inform you than to get you to cycle through a variety of ads. And those ads, of course, pay for much of what appears on the internet and in apps such as Facebook. And this expression from Maher is a kind of chilling reflection of what's going on in the internet. A book I much admire that looks at the effect of technology on our lives is called Alone Together, which is written by Sherry Turkle, who is a psychologist at MIT. And Alone Together focuses on how technology has changed essentially our relationship with ourselves. And a later book that I'll talk about shortly focuses on how it's changed our relationship with one another. And Alone Together, which is in itself a telling phrase, explores relationships that people have with robots, with texting, with avatars. Avatars are kind of fictional lives that some people create online. Of course, Facebook, the internet, and she focuses in Alone Together, especially among adolescents and young adults. And in her view, the new technology is controlling, but not really liberating. It was supposed to free up time, allow us to do more things, but in point of fact, it tends to invade and control our lives. And we've all had the experience of getting emails and phone calls unwanted at night, on weekends. The new technology is invasive. It's personality altering, especially among young people who try to shape their lives to be compelling in Facebook and other social media. It's risky because almost everything that we put out on the internet or in various apps is subject to exposure. And so there's the illusion of privacy that it's you and your phone or it's you and your computer, but it turns out to be discoverable, much to the detriment of the unwitting and the unwary. And it turns out that it's destructive of empathy. And because we're not looking at people face to face in a real life setting, what conversations that occur on the web can be remarkably cruel and hurtful. And Turkle concludes, we expect more from technology and less from each other as a result of the new digital media. A second, more recent book by Turkle is called Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in the Digital Age. This book is really a sustained scholarly plea for the recovery of meaningful face-to-face conversations in families, schools, workplaces, and communities. And she says in this book, the internet gives us the possibility of sharing our views with anyone in the world, but it also can support information silos where we don't talk to anyone, who doesn't agree with us. So technology can sustain ever more rigid partisanship. It makes it hard to talk, enabling us to live in information bubbles that don't let in dissenting voices. The slow, hard work of politics, study, analysis, listening, trying to convince someone with a different point of view, these can get lost when politics goes online. Interesting, in her book, Turkle talks about what happens during a catastrophe. And we're in the midst of the pandemic, and all of a sudden, we're getting things done. And she comments on that. When you name something a catastrophe, there's nothing much to say. When we go into crisis mode, we give ourselves permission to defer the kinds of conversation that politics requires. And right now, our politics requires conversations too long deferred. And the point of this observation is that Congress and the president and the governors, state legislators have proved to be remarkably responsive to the pandemic. So we've had seemingly months, if not years, of political stalemate, and all of a sudden, there is, fortunately for us, a remarkably rapid and sweeping response to the pandemic. But afterwards, there will be much work to do, and then we will have to reclaim conversation and to have sensible, civil conversations across our differences. And so, as encouraged as we might be by the spirit of cooperation that we now see in the pandemic, we have to anticipate the challenges that will remain when the crisis has passed and our big problems, policy issues remain. So if the technology is a problem, the kind of white-hot partisanship, or should I say the blue-hot partisanship that we see in our country is another source of profanity in our politics. A book I much admire is by Sean Trinde called The Lost Majority. And Mr. Trinde makes a very simple point, and that is that because of the close balance between the parties and the critical way that the electorate examines the performance of a party in office, every election is up for grabs. He writes, each election cycle presents parties with choices, both in how they approach the election and if they win, how they govern. Sometimes they choose well, sometimes they choose poorly, and sometimes they run into events that are out of their control. The pandemic would be an example. Regardless, another election is inevitably no more than 2 years away, and its outcome is unknown. And it's precisely because the outcome is unknown that I think it gives a intensity and a harshness, a profanity to the way our politics plays out. This chart shows party unity votes in Congress as a percent of all votes. And it's somewhat visually congested, but the line slopes upward from left to right. And what it shows is that over time, voting in the Congress has become much more polarized, with Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. Another measure of the intensity of partisanship and the balance is to look at divided control. Divided control refers to situations in which one party controls the presidency, and the other party controls one or both houses of Congress. And so if you look at this chart, which covers 1901 to 1960, if you see a red band across the chart, then that means that Republicans had complete control of the presidency, House, and Senate. You see a blue band, that's a period of Democratic control. And what you'll notice is from 1901 through 1960, there was divided control at the national level in only 10 years, and 6 of those years occurred during the Eisenhower administration. So divided control was a relatively infrequent occurrence in the first 60 years of the 20th century. Now, take a look at divided control from 1961 through 2020, and you see a lot of yellow bands. Yellow bands indicate divided control between the president and Congress. And so during that period, divided control occurred in 38 years overall out of 60, and in 30 out of the past 40 years. And so the possibility of one party displacing the other party in the presidency or in the House and the Senate is before us, especially in the Congress, which can change majority hands every 2 years. And this, I think, fuels an intensity in our politics. Here's a different way of summarizing it. In the 30 years since 1990, Democrats have controlled the presidency for 16 years, Republicans for 14. Democrats have controlled the House for 10 years, the Republicans for 20. Democrats have controlled the Senate for 16 years, Republicans for 14. By contrast, we might go back to the period beginning in 1955. From 1955 through 1994, 40 years, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives for all of that time. So there's a very close partisan balance at the national level, and control of the national government, either the presidency or one or both houses of Congress, is within the grasp of either party. What we see at the national level is reflected in the increasing partisanship in the electorate. This chart shows split ticket voting, and there's been a dramatic decline in the last 30 or 40 years in split ticket voting in the mid 80s, which was about 44%. So split ticket meaning that people vote for the presidential candidate of one party, congressional candidate of the other party. And you can see the sharp decline through 2016. I had occasion in preparing for this talk today to look again at the presidential race in 2016. It's useful to recall that Donald Trump carried Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by a total of just under 78,000 votes. And these states counted for 16, 20, and 10 electoral votes for a total of 26 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton carried the national popular vote by 2.9 million votes. And yet Donald Trump's 46 electoral votes in these three states provided the margin that he needed. He totaled 306 electoral votes, just 36 more than the 270 he needed for election. It's interesting. Jill Stein, you recall she was the Green Party candidate. Her popular vote total exceeded Trump's popular vote margin in each of the three states I've mentioned. And this was brought about a complaint from Hillary Clinton that if Stein hadn't been on the ballot, perhaps she would have won. But the same can be said of Gary Johnson's popular vote. He was the Libertarian candidate, and his margin in each of those three states also exceeded Trump's margin of victory. I might mention finally that in 2012, Barack Obama carried the same three states by a total margin of nearly 1 million votes. What's the point? Our elections are very close. There has been a trade-off over time with great frequency between the two parties for control of the presidency and the Congress. And this, I think, fuels an intensity and a roughness in the way our politics is played out. Certainly, we've become intensely divided in partisan terms. What shows on the screen now is a poll that looks at support for President Trump last fall, and he enjoyed support from 91% of Republicans and only 5% of Democrats. And the Republican-Democratic gap, 86 points, matched a historic high. Interestingly enough, the same 86-point gap appeared in the fall of 2012 when Barack Obama was running for re-election. There was a study, a survey done a couple of years ago that asked Republicans and Democrats to give their views of the other party. And as I've quoted here, nearly 60% of Republicans and more than 60% of Democrats agree that the opposing party is a serious threat to the United States and its people. Interestingly, the Pew Foundation, which does an extensive amount of surveying of the American electorate, recently found that more than 70% of Democrats who are looking to have a romantic relationship would not consider dating a Trump supporter. Republicans were somewhat antagonistic to dating Democrats, but not so much as Democrats who were rejecting the opportunity for a relationship with a Trump supporter. So there's a fair amount of partisanship, intense partisanship among the electorate and among our elected officials. And our elections are closely contested. And so one might celebrate the close partisan balance, but of course, it has produced a kind of depressing, even a decadent sort of politics that is reflected in the profane rhetoric that I find troubling. An interesting account of our politics that looks beyond the election returns is by Yuval Levin, a book called The Fractured Republic. And Levin suggests that both Republican conservatives and liberal Democrats are blinded by nostalgia. In his view, liberals hope for a return to the 1960s. Conservatives want to replay the 1980s. And neither group is likely to get their wish because things have changed. And Levin points to changed economic circumstances. Over time, the economy has become better at meeting individual consumer needs, but worse at protecting workers as a class, and we're seeing that now, and changed cultural circumstances. Levin says, inevitably, the loosening of social strictures and the blurring of moral boundaries unleashes not only gentle toleration, but also harsh chaos. And this is a reference to the culture wars that feed into our political divisions. He goes on to note, on the one hand, public trust in their governing institutions has been in a long-term decline and our politics is more polarized. On the other hand, we have tended to respond to these diffusing forces, that is, forces that push us apart, by consolidating the remaining power of government in our centralized national state. And that's an issue to which I'll return later on. One of the most challenging and engaging books on our political situation is by Patrick J. Deneen, who's on the faculty at Notre Dame, political philosopher, and the book is called Why Liberalism Has Failed. And he divides our political classes somewhat differently than we're used to, because he says that both conservatives and progressives share fundamental agreement about underlying values. And what he calls conservative liberals, we would call conservatives, and progressive liberals, both share a common commitment to maximizing individual liberty, although the two sides define individual liberty differently. Here's what he says. Although conservative liberals claim to defend not only a free market, but family values and federalism, the only part of their agenda that has been successfully defended during their recent political ascendance is economic liberalism, including deregulation, globalization, and the protection of titanic economic inequalities. And while progressive liberals claim to advance a shared sense of national identity that should reduce income inequality, The only part of the left's political agenda that has triumphed has been the project of personal and especially sexual autonomy. Is it mere coincidence that both parties, despite their claims to be locked in a political death grip, mutually advance the cause of liberal autonomy and equality? Deneen goes on to observe that the commitment of elites to democracy is somewhat unpredictable. He says, democracy is an acceptable legitimating tool only as long as its practices are broadly supportive of liberal assumptions. American elites have periodically essayed the possibility of severely limiting democracy, believing that democracy will undermine policies preferred by experts. And here he's talking about the tendency of elites on both sides of the political spectrum to turn to the courts and to bureaucrats to make decisions that might otherwise be made by legislatures. And here is his explanation for the Trump phenomenon and the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. We should not be surprised that even a degraded citizenry will throw off the enlightened shackles of a liberal order, particularly as the very successes of that order generate the pathologies of a citizenry that finds itself powerless before the forces of government, economy, technology, and globalizing forces. And what Deneen calls for is a return to private organizations, family, church, community, as an alternative to the centralizing national politics. Interestingly, Deneen draws on the work of Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to this country in the 1830s and commented on the beauty and the defects of democracy. And Tocqueville's description of democracy seems to have an uncanny insight into our own time. And here's what he says: the growing love of prosperity and the shifting nature of property lead democratic nations to dread all material upheavals. This naturally inclines citizens to grant endless new rights to central government, which alone appears to them to be possessed of both the interest and the means to defend them from anarchy. And so we have both parties offering different recipes for the growth of national government. And especially now, where the parties have come together for a radical expansion of government in response to the pandemic. Here's the interesting part of Tocqueville's further analysis. Democratic nations often hate those in power whose hands central power is placed, but they always retain their affection for power itself. And you could go back to the chart that shows the division. Democrats loved Obama and hated Trump, and Republicans love Trump and hate Obama. And you can see, but both parties are contending for an expansion of national power. And that's a point that Deneen has made. So I mentioned earlier, a definition of blue is depressing and decadent. A new book that takes up this subject is by Ross Douthat, who writes for the New York Times, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. And to offer a summary of Douthat's very engaging book, he suggests that the moon landing marked the beginning of American and Western decline. In a sense, the moon landing was the last great enterprise that captured the imagination of the American society. And since that time, things have perhaps gotten different and technologically more innovative, but not in a fundamental way. And there is a passage in which he offers the reader a choice. What would you do if you had a choice essentially between indoor plumbing and your iPhone? What would you take? Of course, most of us would pick indoor plumbing, and the illustration tends to show that for all of the technological innovation of the last 50 years hasn't changed our lives as fundamentally as changes that occurred in the 1800s and early 1900s. He speaks as part of this decadence that we've reached an age of economic limits. The weight of demographics indicates that we're getting older and the fertility rate is declining. He mentions the overhang of debt that we talked about last week. The constraints on education refers to the fact that earlier in this century we had an enormous improvement in the economy because of education, but he said the gains to education can't be repeated. It's sort of a one-time element. And then the constraints imposed by the environment, because we can no longer despoil the environment in behalf of economic growth, and we have to invest in controls that address climate change. Interestingly, Dothit, in the later half of his book, considers where we're headed. And one of his dystopian scenarios is an economic meltdown in China that throws the world into a global recession to which Congress is unable to respond. That starts to look like the coronavirus pandemic, except Congress has proved itself, for the moment, able to respond, and we can be encouraged by that. This is a book that's worth your time. Well, this is somewhat dispiriting or depressing, and I want to suggest that perhaps there's a way to a better future. And here's the blue sky a picture I took from my doorstep. A book I really admire is another one by Yuval Levin. It's called A Time to Build: From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. He makes a very fundamental distinction between two kinds of institutions. Institutions he calls formative and institutions performative. He writes, "We have moved from thinking of institutions as molds that shape people's characters and habits towards seeing them as platforms that allow people to be themselves and to display themselves before a wider world." The problem with our politics today is not fundamentally a problem of ideology. Rather, the dysfunctions of our political culture are the result of a kind of breakdown of political psychology unleashed and unmoored from institutional constraints. If people involved in the political world play roles in the sense that actors do, it becomes nearly impossible for them to play roles in the sense that leaders and citizens do. And he refers as kind of performers as opposed to leaders who act within institutions, Donald Trump for one, and Ocasio-Cortez as a second. And he essentially takes us back through some of the issues that I've addressed in the course of the talk today. Social media platforms drive us to speak without listening, to approach others confrontationally rather than graciously, to spread conspiracies and rumors, to dismiss and ignore what we would rather not hear, to make the private public, to oversimplify a complex world, to react to one another much too quickly and curtly. Our souls and our institutions shape each other in an ongoing way. This is both good news and bad. When they are flourishing, our institutions make us more decent, responsible, habituating us in exactly the sorts of virtues a free society requires. The exercise of these virtues, in turn, helps our institutions flourish. We trust our institutions when they form people in them to be more worthy of trust and provide everyone else with standards by which to judge those people. But in recent decades, we've watched our institutions gradually lose sight of the importance of that function and instead begin to serve merely as platforms upon which individuals can perform. To regain our trust, the people who populate our institutions would need to understand themselves through those institutions again, to see their roles and characters as formed by them. And Levin sets out a kind of blueprint by which we can improve the performance of Congress, the presidency, our institutions, communities, families. And this is a kind of picture of a brighter, bluer, blue sky future. Levin's book put me in mind of one of my favorite speeches from another era. People forget that the Constitution, as drafted at Philadelphia, was a controversial document when it was sent back to the states for ratification. And in fact, one of the reasons that the delegates at Philadelphia were able to agree is that people who were skeptical of the constitutional enterprise stayed away. Patrick Henry was invited to go to Philadelphia in 1787, and he famously said he wouldn't go because he smelt a rat. And so when the Constitution was signed at Philadelphia and sent back to the states, Virginia was one of the states where resistance to ratification was greatest. And in the event, Virginia ratified by the vote of 89 to 79, but only after Madison promised to work for a Bill of Rights, meaning that if I have a dozen delegates to the Virginia ratifying convention had changed their mind, Virginia would not have ratified. And New York, which considered the Constitution a month later and approved by only 3 votes, certainly wouldn't have ratified. The government without Virginia and New York would certainly have failed. One of the most telling moments of the month-long debate at the Virginia Ratifying Convention of 1788 involved James Madison's response to Patrick Henry. And Patrick Henry had taken a scalpel of the Constitution and suggested that the various checks and balances that had been written into the Constitution would simply be insufficient to guarantee Republican government. And here was Madison's response. I go on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. If there be sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of these men, so that we do not depend on their virtue or put confidence in our rulers, but in the people who are to choose them. And so ultimately, the American experiment depends on virtue in the people. It depends on us. And here's the 4th story. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, I had the privilege of serving as the executive director of the Virginia Commission on the Bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. And in essence, the task of the commission was to tell the very important role that Virginia played in the writing and ratification of the Constitution. And as the life of the commission was nearing the end, a person came up to me and asked me a question. And for one of the rare times in my life, I gave exactly the answer that I wanted to give, and it's held up, I think, over the years. And here was the question. Well, you've studied the founding era, you've read the debates in Philadelphia and the debates in Virginia. What is it that most impresses you about that story? And my answer was this: they had the debate. By which I meant that in order to have the debate and the vigorous disagreements, especially those that occurred in Virginia, New York, they had to agree on fundamental values. They had to be able to speak across their differences and ultimately bring these matters to the votes that brought about great results, the writing and ratification of the Constitution. This brings me to one final book to recommend to you, a book I mentioned in the beginning lecture by C. Bradley Thompson, America's Revolutionary Mind, A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it. Recall that this book argues that the Declaration of Independence is not just Jefferson's declaration, but in fact, Jefferson was really speaking for a generation of founders who put their lives in sacred honor at risk for the break from England. And the views that are infused in the Declaration of Independence were developed over decades and reflect this kind of settled understanding of the meaning of the Declaration that we continue to engage in the current time. Thompson writes, the American mind was forged in the 1760s and 1770s under the pressure of events provoked by the imperial crisis and as a result of the provincials' confrontation with certain philosophic ideas. It was a revolution that advanced new moral values and virtues, new manners and mores, and a new way to think about moral character and moral action. From this fundamental change in America's moral values followed all of the subsequent social, political, and economic changes that would come to define a new way of life in America. We can profitably begin a more civilized conversation by returning to our roots, by looking at this book and at the Declaration of Independence and beginning to shape and recover virtue in the people that is fundamental to the success of our democratic experiment. It has been so great to be with you for these 4 weeks. I wish you continued health. Something Blue, Profanity and the Decline of Civility in the Public Square has been today's topic. If you want to write to me, I'd love to hear from you. Tim O'Rourke, my email is there, polysciprof@cox.net. Please reach out to me, and here we are at the conclusion. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. Please take care, be safe. I look forward to seeing you in the future.